Now let me start with Gordon Brown's book, which was very important for me and even more important for my first guest this evening. The book reveals that the United States government knew all along that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and that, therefore, Tony Blair was lying to the Queen, to her Parliament, to her armed forces, and to the British public. They knew that he was, at the very least, stating a falsehood. It is possible that they never pointed this out to him, but unlikely, as you may recall, the President's brain was missing, and Tony Blair was the President's brain. It is, to me, inconceivable that this central truth, that Mr. Blair was selling this war on a gigantic falsehood, could not have escaped Tony Blair's attention. It cannot possibly be true that in this most special of special relationships, the United States government decided to leave Mr. Blair in the dark, not least because they would be hanging him out to dry when it became clear there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, as quickly became clear after the war. How was Mr. Blair to answer the inevitable questions thereafter? It is possible that Mr. Blair was a fool, but it's much more likely that he was a knave. Now, I have met and spoken with Tony Blair many times in my life, and I only want to do so one more time at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But my next guest met him more recently than I. Bill Stewartson's son was killed at the age of 21 as part of the British occupation in Basra. Nonetheless, Bill stoutly, loyally stood by the war until something happened. Let's hear it straight from him. Bill Stewardson, welcome to the mother of all talk shows.
Good evening, George, and good evening to everybody listening in.
Well, I think many people are very keen to hear your story, Bill. Start, if you will, with what happened to your boy.
Well, Al was one of those guys that was never going to fit into working for an agency on Civvy Street, putting the round peg in the round hole. He was better than that, so he did all the rigorous training and got himself to the level where he could go out to Iraq and, in his eyes, help a population that was being butchered and paid for it with his young life, George, which, given recent events, is somewhat disturbing.
Tell us the first of those recent events, will you? The letter you received.
Well, quite out of the blue, I received a handwritten letter from Tony Blair.
This is 10 years after your son's death.
Yeah, well, it was like 3 months ago. Yeah. Basically, thanking me for the line that I'd always adhered to in being, as I saw it, George, quite open-minded and fair, and refusing to run with the tabloids, wanting Blair's head on a stick and all that. And just getting a letter like that did actually make me feel quite pleased, because I'd been the voice in the wilderness, and I thought it was a really nice thing to do, and sort of went with it.
You must have wondered why, after 10 years, he'd written to you, though.
Well, maybe I'm a bit naive or a thick northerner or something, George, but no, I didn't see it like that. The initial letter I responded to, thanking Mr. Blair for taking the time and everything, at which point I got another letter which stated within it would be good to talk at some point, so I followed that up and went along to Mr. Blair's office and sat with him for an hour and discussed all sorts of stuff. And again, recent events have caused me to look upon that in a different light, and I'm wondering now.
Did he ask you to do anything for him at that meeting?
Not particularly, no. It wouldn't be fair to say that. He was polite, he was pleasant, he was open to a degree, but it was fairly obvious that some things weren't going to get discussed, George, and they never did. And again, me being naive stroke thick, thought somebody was just being nice to me until Mr. Brown's book.
Yes, this book then thuds into your life. What were your thoughts when you read it?
Difficult to quantify, George. I was mega demoralised, extremely angry, and to an extent shocked, and I still am. I cannot believe the contents of that book. And we have to remember that it's all right, Tony Blair's a former Prime Minister, so is Gordon Brown. And I really do not expect people of that standing, of that calibre, to be so at odds with each other and basically underlining that somebody's telling lies somewhere.
Well, the book is unequivocal, isn't it? It states that the United States deceived the British government, and that is, as I've said now twice, 3 times now, a possibility that the American government is so venal that they allowed the British government to lie to their people to get them into the war. That is a possibility, but it's not quite likely because they depended on Tony Blair very considerably to sell this war to the world. And if they had known that he was selling it on a false prospectus and not told them, that would be an act of real treachery, wouldn't it?
It sure would, George. And what you've just outlined there, looking at the events, is actually the best case scenario.
Yep, it is. The best case scenario is that Tony Blair's an idiot.
Well,
and we both know he isn't. That's the point, isn't it, Bill? We both know. You've met him. I know him well. We both know that he's not an idiot. He doesn't have the alibi that George W. Bush had of being an imbecile. This is an Oxford-trained barrister, so smart that in advance of the book coming out of the blue he writes to you, one of his very few friends amongst military families. He then invites you and gives you an hour of his time in advance of the book coming out. I'll tell you what I think, Bill. I think that he thought that this book was going to make a much bigger splash than it has done, and that there might be the kind of backlash that you are now evincing, that people whose children were sacrificed in that war would become very bitter indeed once they learned the truth.
Well, that's the point, George. I have a moral responsibility to the few hundred other people in my position. And my selfishness is out of the window now. It's all right me being smug and nice and thinking, oh, I've met prime ministers. It goes a bit beyond that. I've got to be able to look at certain other people in the eye and be honest with them. And I'm not so sure I can do that anymore now, which I had one huge shock in 2007 and another one's forming in the back of my mind, and I'm unsure who I can believe, who I can rely on, and where I go next with this issue, George, because it will not be allowed to lay to rest now.
No, that's why I was keen to talk with you on the show after we made contact in the last day or so, because this book and its revelation has died as solid a death as the Chilcot report itself did. Who remembers the Chilcot report now? All these years in the making, all these tens of millions of pounds in the expenditure. Nothing came of it. It was left in that very British way to gather dust on the shelves. And now Brown's book, which ought to have caused a political earthquake in this country, made no impact at all. And as far as I know, I may be wrong, as far as I know, this revelation has not even been raised in Parliament.
No. it's a mystery and it's a bit of a shock, and it's actually a rather vivid two fingers to everybody in my position, which is not acceptable.
Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you now feel deceived by Blair?
I feel deceived by Mr. Blair. I feel as though I've been treated appallingly by our American friends, and I feel let down yet again by the inability of the UK establishment to be respectful to people who've lost their loved ones wearing a British military uniform, fighting on behalf of others. I don't know how much lower educated, well-off people can get, George.
Well, I think that's as powerful an indictment as I've heard, so there's nothing thick about you. You may have been naive, if you'll forgive me.
Sure.
I think that you were. But I'll tell you what, Bill, I'm ready to link arms with you now, and let's you and me go into battle to see what we can make of this situation. How's that?
Can we keep in touch, please, George? Because I have got one or two ideas, and you're just the man for the job.
I'm going to do it, you and me. Bill
Thanks,
Stewartson, thanks for joining us